for anybody that's a little bit interested in UFOs, either a skeptical or sort of on the more believer side, would have heard of Stan. He's a nuclear physicist. He's won a lifetime UFO Achievement Award in Leeds, England. He's appeared at the UN twice. He's written congressional testimony. He's spoken at more MUFON conferences than any. He's written lots of books, and he's kind of, we were joking around in the studio earlier, he's like the godfather of ufology. So he's a fellow Canadian as well, and we're so happy to have you here, Stan. Thanks for taking the time.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I'm a dual citizen. I can complain about both governments, the U.S. and Canada, legally.
But you still live in Canada, right?
Oh, yes. Well, what do you mean still? I've only lived here for 35 years.
So
that's what's been half my life.
Have you ever
I've only lived here for 34 years.
Have you thought about moving to the South at all?
Well, I moved here from California. Why would I want to move back?
Well, because it's pretty cold where you are, isn't it?
Well, hey, I'm a sturdy guy. I grew up in New Jersey. You can handle anything. But, I had a call from a friend in California. What are you doing back there, Stan? I'm in Fredericton, New Brunswick, for anybody who worries about such things. And what are you doing back there? Don't you miss California? And I said, well, yeah, California had great climate, and Mother Nature was very generous. There's Yosemite and the ocean and all that sort of stuff. And it did take me a while to get used to not having earthquakes and drive-by shooting and miserable traffic and terrible smog. But you know what? I learned to do without those things.
Nice.
Don't have them here.
And you're in, the polite country, so...
Yeah, well, Fredericton is a great place to raise a family. Home of the University of New Brunswick, which is the oldest English language university in Canada, mind you. So I've never regretted the move. I'd have somebody shovel my driveway, of course.
So we were debating here before we called you on whether to get you to talk about
the nuclear stuff.
A little bit, no, a little bit about the history of how you got into ufology, and because we thought, well, we don't have, we have a lot of listeners that are interested in UFOs, but we also have potential to reach people that would probably, that you could really sort of maybe change their mind or get them to think a little deeper on the subject. So we probably should just, for maybe like the Reader's Digest version of how you got started into ufology.
Yeah. It's easy enough. I was a young nuclear physicist, 24, working for General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1958. And I'm a cheapskate. I was ordering books from a mail-order book place, and I needed one more book so I wouldn't have to pay shipping. And there was the report on unidentified flying objects by Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt. He had headed Project Blue Book back in the early 50s. This was in 1958. And the book was marked down hardcover, $2.95 to $1. Shipping would have been $1. It was going to be free. And so I ordered it. I thought, what the heck? Air Force was co-sponsor of our little aircraft nuclear propulsion program. I say little. In 1958, we spent $100 million. We employed 3,500 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. And I mention this not to brag. I mean, the program got canceled, of course, as everything else I worked on. In fact. But there are an awful lot of people who don't seem to understand that there's an awful lot of important research and development, and expensive research and development, that goes on in industry and in the national laboratories and outside of academia. And that you got to learn, you got to study the evidence, and most of it is not published in scientific journals, peer-reviewed scientific journals. People seem to think that's where all research gets published. It isn't. And so the program was big, it was exciting, it was fun. It got canceled, okay, but I got the book, I read it. I was not totally convinced, but I was very intrigued, as it turned out. And I read 10 more books, and the next year after that, I moved to California. And it turns out it was a very lucky first book to read, because several of the ones I read after that, if I'd read them first, I'd have never read another one.
Right.
And so I was reading all these books, and then I made an incredible discovery. totally unexpectedly at the University of California, Berkeley Library, and I found a copy of the largest study ever done on flying saucers for the government, Air Force, as a matter of fact, Project Blue Book Special Report number 14. And it had data on 3,201 sightings. The work was done at Battelle Memorial Institute, which is a major research and development firm. It was under Air Force contract. But what really got to me, besides the more than 200 charts, tables, graphs, and maps, I mean, I was in data heaven. But what really got to me is the guy who put it together, Dr. Leon Davidson, had compiled this because he got a copy. When it came out, they put out a press release, but they didn't release the report. He managed to get a copy. And in the press release, I was shocked to see the Secretary of the Air Force, no less, lying through his teeth. In the press release, it said, on the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. That sounds very straightforward. It was a total lie. I had to report. I was looking at the charts and tables and stuff. The unknowns weren't 3%. They were 21.5%. And they were completely separate from the 9.3% of the cases for which there was insufficient information. So that part of the statement wasn't true. They did a quality evaluation. The better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable. They asked an obvious question. Okay, we got all these reports. Is there really any difference between the unknowns and the knowns? Maybe we just missed the boat. They did, it's called a chi-square statistical analysis. Don't worry about the details. On the basis of 6 different characteristics, are the unknowns different from the knowns? The answer is yes. The probability that the two groups are the same is less than 1%. So I got mad. I wanted to get to the bottom of this. I don't like being lied to. I mean, I worked under security. Sure, sometimes you got to, how shall I put it, tiptoe around the truth. That's one way to put it. But a flat-out lie like that, that really made me angry. And so I joined APRO and NICAP, the two big groups. Don't exist anymore. I'm still around. I did a lot of reading, a lot of talking. I didn't really get my first lecture until 1967. And that was only by accident. I stuck my neck out. Frank Edwards, I don't know if you've heard of him. He wrote a book, Flying Saucer Serious Business. He was a journalist. Mm-hmm. Knew everybody. He was on the board at NICAP. And this is in the 60s. And he sent me a copy of the book because I moved to Indianapolis to work for General Motors on a nuclear project. That also got canceled, but what the heck. Allison Division in Indianapolis. And I called Frank and I said, I want to go public, Frank. You know everybody. Give me some names because I just moved to Pittsburgh to work for Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab on a nuclear rocket program. And believe it or not, we actually tested a nuclear rocket engine. That was exciting. Of course, they canceled the program right afterward, but that's the way things go. Anyway, Frank gave me some names. I love the name of the first program to have me on. Contact! And it was strictly by luck. I had called them. I talked to the producer. Don't call us. We'll call you. I thought being a Westinghouse nuclear physicist in Pittsburgh, which is a Westinghouse town, would count for something. It didn't. And then I got, less than a month later, I got a call from him at 6:30. Could you please do our program at 7 o'clock? I live near the station, fortunately. And I've always wondered, how many people did they call before they got to me? From the bottom of the barrel. Anyway, I did the program. Somebody at work at Westinghouse heard me and wanted me to talk to her book review club because they were reviewing Frank's book. That's my first lecture in somebody's living room. And I did that program many times, gave a lecture because the dean at Carnegie Tech his wife worked at Westinghouse, and I rode to work with her one day, 2 days in a 3-year period. And I said, gee, I'd like to speak at Carnegie Tech. And she says, well, why don't you talk to the dean? I said, well, I talked to Dr. So-and-so, and he wasn't interested. She said, Stan, the dean's my husband. He's heard you on the radio. Why don't you give him a call? So I did. And we booked a talk. It was a strange conversation. It was going to be an afternoon talk, which meant I'd have to take some time off work. And his last question was, how much do you want? Well, how about $100? I figured he'd knock me down to 50. He bought me at 100 because I knew his wife. And then he told me what he was paying the other speakers in the series. 1,500, 1,700, 1,600. Well, the talk went extremely well. He wrote the agent through whom he had booked those other speakers, and that agent booked me at the Engineering Society of Detroit for $300 in expenses. I was in the big time. And that talk was very important because this wasn't a bunch of little old ladies in tennis shoes, in other words. Don't hear that expression much anymore. But 1,008 people for dinner and a talk. They were sold out 3 weeks in advance, and there wasn't one negative question. Now, I could not help but respect the audience. And I spoke to an audience in Pittsburgh, joint meeting of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics and the Institute of Electric and Electronic Engineers. Packed house, and they had to stop the question and answer period because so much interest. Again, no negative questions. And my boss's boss's boss was there. So I was really enjoying speaking. It turns out I'm a ham. I'm a real Leo. And I was enjoying. And then I asked my boss, I said, look, I need some guidance. I don't want to lose my job. I've got a security clearance. I don't want to lose that. I mean, I got a mortgage and a wife and kids and so forth. Give me some rules of the trade, so to speak. Mm-hmm. They came back to me, 3 rules. You can say what you please on your time. You can identify yourself as a Westinghouse nuclear physicist. But we'd like you to put a disclaimer at the beginning of the lecture. The views you're about to hear are mine and mine alone and not those of my employer. I said, fine. Now, who could ask for anything more? Well, I did ask for anything more because I got a call from a colleague at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. Hey, Stan, here you've been doing a lot of lectures. Yeah. How about speaking to our American Nuclear Society chapter here? Now, I'm a member of the American Nuclear Society, so I said, sure, I'd love to. No, I mean on an expense account, Stan. Oh, I don't make those decisions. And I asked management. They paid for me to go from Pittsburgh to New Mexico to give a lecture, Flying Saucers Are Real. We weren't hiding it. And I gave the lecture. There were 500 people there. No negative questions.
And you've wrote a book about that as well, have you not?
Well, I mentioned this in books, and the kicker is I mention this because there are a lot of people who think, well, nobody believes in flying saucers. They must give him a hard time. I've given over 700 lectures, and I've only had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk. And that's everywhere. I mean, I've spoken in all 50 states, all 10 provinces, and 18 other countries. And when I go to India next month, that'll be the 19th country. And you get more than 11 hecklers if you talk about sports, religion, politics. You know, that's what they tell me anyway. So I come on very strong. And it turns out I learned a couple of truths fairly early on. I started asking at the end of my lecture, how many people here believe that they have seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer, having defined my terms earlier. And I prefer the term flying saucer because all flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers. You know, all great-grandfathers are men, but not all men are great-grandfathers. And so when I ask that question, I'll make a joke, we didn't let the CIA in, stuff like that. And I'm just going to point and count, no names required. So I do that. And it shocks people because the first hands go up cautiously, just barely over their head. And by the time I turn to the other side of the room, they go up vigorously because lots of people, it turns out, typically 10% of the audience believe they've seen one. But then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands go down.
Yeah.
If there's anybody left, I'll say, how many of you were in the military at the time? Still anybody left? You want to tell us about it? I don't ask for names or anything. And, at the University of Indiana, or in Indianapolis at this time, I went through that, and I said, you want to tell us about it? And the guy says, they took my pictures. Long silence. I said, well, I'm sure the audience would like to hear the rest of the story. I'm not asking your name. You don't need to stand up. So somebody got him a microphone. And he tells about he was flying a 4-engine Air Force plane across the Pacific. Another plane 20 miles ahead, radioed saucer heading your way. They had gun cameras. They took pictures. And then radioed the base to which they were going because the crew doesn't handle the film. This is intelligence material. And they landed. The film was taken. They were debriefed and told never to say anything. And I'll guarantee you 99% of the people there believed him. He just came across so well. He wasn't looking for anything. He didn't have a book to sell. I didn't have one either at that time.
Did you find that most of these guys were seeing saucers? Like, nowadays it seems there's a lot more triangle sightings and stuff, but, I'm using a saucer in the generic term, and clearly manufactured objects behaving in ways that the things we manufacture can't behave.
Right.
And so that they don't show any license plates and stuff like that. But the ability to make right-angled turns, stop, start, hover, move straight up, straight down, land in the middle of nowhere in a space not much larger than themselves and take off from there, and do it without noise, without visible external engine, without wings, and without a tail. That's pretty special. And if we had them, we'd use them in the few wars that have gone on this planet. I get a kick out of people telling me, it was all Nazi technology. Oh, Hitler was such a nice guy that they figured out how to build saucers, but he didn't want to hurt anybody, so he wouldn't use them. I mean, that's ridiculous,
So have you noticed a difference in people answering that question? Like over the years, have more people started reporting them?
No, it's typically 10%. And, what's interesting to me is the similarities between audiences, not only on that level, but what they really want to know about. They have no trouble accepting the data. I'm a data man. I present tables, charts, graphs, maps. I talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies. And I'm a little sneaky. I'll ask after each one, how many people here read this? And if I'm lucky, it's 2%. That helps keep down the noise in the audience. That is, people coming at me strong who don't know anything, but they don't want me to be able to say, you haven't read any of those reports I talked about, have you? I had a guy in Pittsburgh, Gulf Research Lab, interrupted me 3 times, and finally the boss man said, hey, let him finish. So I finish, and I looked to him. He says, well, I'm sure one could come to other conclusions than the ones you've come to. And I said, well, let me see now. As I recall, you hadn't read any of those 5 large-scale scientific studies, had you? Well, no. Well, that's the difference between us, isn't it? I gave you my conclusion. I gave you my sources. You hadn't read any of them. I've read them all. Whose opinion's worth more? Long silence.
Clearly yours, Stan.
What?
Clearly your opinion. You've done the most research. You're like the Godfather.
Well, I learned a rule in the 5th grade. Have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. And I was a high school debater. We won a state championship one year. And that applied there as well. And, Look, I figured once that over the years I've answered probably 60,000 questions. That's not only at lectures, but at interviews like this one and classroom visits, which I do often on campuses. And people seem to have no trouble accepting the evidence that I present. The chart that shows the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be an unknown, stuff like that. What they really want to know is the why questions. You know, why would anybody come here? Why don't they land on the White House lawn? Why doesn't the government tell us what it knows? And the usual response when I give an answer, I mean, I've got to be ready to answer those questions, of course. And I do in my books. There's a whole chapter, the UFO why questions and flying saucers and science. And the usual response from the people who ask those questions are, I hadn't thought of it that way. Well, I have, because I'm forced to. I mean, I can't say, I'll get back to you tomorrow on I'm on the stage. I need an answer now. I'm talking to you. I can't say, call me again next week, will you? We'll figure that one out. And the thing is that I've had to think about these questions. And I do have some advantages. One, I've worked on far-out propulsion systems. One of the loudest arguments from the nasty, noisy negativist is, you can't get here from there. It would violate the laws of physics. That's malarkey. I mean, how long does it take to go around the planet Earth? Well, it must take at least 3 years. That's how long it took Magellan. The space station does it in 95 minutes. The key thing about technology is progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. I worked on fission and fusion rockets. We didn't just talk about these things, on the nuclear rocket program. This is back in the late 60s, mind you. Westinghouse, Aerojet General, and Los Alamos each built a separate system, very similar. Liquid hydrogen was the propellant. They were all under 8 feet in diameter. Power levels varied. From Westinghouse, our system operated at 1,100 megawatts. And I'll relate that to something real in a minute. Aerojet, 1,000 megawatts. And Los Alamos, 4,400 megawatts. Now, Hoover Dam out there in Nevada produces 2,000 megawatts. And it's a big old sucker. An 8-foot diameter rocket engine. Well, of course, our exit exhaust temperature, a little over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. These were very impressive systems. And our reward for being successful was they canceled the program. What can I do? The second thing is that working under security. I know how security works, and it's surprising how many people don't. I get people, I'm a big fan of certain documents about Operation Majestic 12. Most of them are phony, but I'm only interested in the real ones. And I get people telling me, those guys would have told their wives what they were doing. No, they wouldn't. Yeah. I never told my wife anything classified. It'd be ridiculous to do that. Secrets, look, Lockheed built a
SR-71
quiet airplane, and they only spent $10 billion to do it in 10 years' time, totally classified.
So, Stan,
the first spy satellite, the Corona spy satellite, that's the town where Roswell incident actually happened, believe it or not. The U-2, was kept classified. The Russians knew about it, but they didn't want to admit that they couldn't shoot it down. We, in the United States, didn't want to admit we were flying it because we were violating international law. Somebody's airspace we were violating. Okay, then they shot down one of our U-2s, and we admitted reluctantly that it was a spy plane. Well, at the very time that was going on, we were trying to build a satellite, 1960 or so, and would you believe there were 12 failures in a row in secret? Nobody knew about them. They weren't cheap. The 13th one worked. And it got more data about Soviet military installations than all the U-2 flights that preceded it, all in secret. Now, admittedly, finally, we said that we had done this. In 1990, 30 years later, no, governments can't keep secrets. And what I show people, because I can't hold it close to the phone. You still won't see it. But the NSA, for example, after a legal battle and a Freedom of Information Action suit and so forth, finally released 156 top-secret Umbra UFO documents. The NSA, wow. There was a little problem. You could read one sentence per page. Everything else was whited out because of national security. The CIA released dozens of top-secret CIA UFO documents, all blacked out. Well, you could read 5 words on this page, 4 words on that page, that sort of thing. So if anybody wants to say, prove it, that they're covering things up, I would mention those. And, don't tell me you'll scrape off the whiteout off the NSA documents, because they Xerox them first, of course, and there's nothing underneath. But, secrecy goes with the territory. And it shocks people when I point out that this is 3 years back, the Washington Post said that the total military intelligence budget for that year was $52.6 billion.
In the
That's
60s?
NSA,
No,
CIA,
a couple years ago,
and
yeah.
NRO. That's a lot of dough where I come from.
Yeah.
And so now, about the propulsion system, I should point out that we've joined the nuclear guys in the universe. Almost all the energy in the galaxy and in the universe is produced by nuclear fusion in the stars. They're not burning gas. Our sun produces energy by nuclear fusion. And nuclear fusion, people will recognize what goes on in H-bombs. You can call it an H-bomb, you can call it a fusion device, whatever. But let's look at what happened. It was first discovered, theorized, in 1938. Now, in 1944, and what are we going to do with it? We're going to build a bomb, of course. That's what we need to do. So in 1944, our blockbuster bombs, new bombs, were developed for the B-29, huge airplane by that day's standard. And that bomb, a 10-ton blockbuster, would release the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. Make a big hole in the ground, boy, and we used a lot of them in 44. In 1945, we tested our first fission bomb. Uranium, plutonium, that sort of stuff. It released the energy, kind of hard to imagine, of 16,000 tons of TNT. They go from 10 to 16,000. That was in 45. Hiroshima and Nagasaki about the same amount. In 1952, we exploded our first H-bomb fusion device. 10 million tons of TNT energy equivalent release. One lousy bomb. And I do consider nuclear weapons lousy. I mean, I'm not proud that we have developed those, but it means we've grown in our understanding. Well,
where do you fall in on nuclear energy?
What?
Where do you fall in on nuclear energy?
Well, I think it's the best way to avoid greenhouse gas. But let me extend this one more step. The Russians, a few years later, tested their big one, 57 million tons of TNT energy release in one stinking weapon.
Tsar bomb or whatever they called it, right? The Tsar bomb?
Yeah.
Is that the one you're talking about? Yeah.
Well, they had other names for it, the big one and stuff. But the important thing is that we have demonstrated to our visitors that we're part of the nuclear energy, nuclear world, fusion world. Mm-hmm. We can go to the stars. Now, if we want to spend the dough, we can go. That's a good, hey, I like that. If we want to spend the dough, we can go. And I worked on a study of fusion propulsion in 1962. You can kick particles out the back end of a fusion rocket that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in a dumb old chemical rocket. Now, I mention this because we have all this talk about aliens in outer space, the SETI community, and all this sort of stuff. And they look at chemical rockets. Dr. Tyson, Neil deGrasse Tyson, head of the Hayden Planetarium, he said on the Peter Jennings mockumentary, I called it, way back in 2005, that our fastest craft, the Voyager spacecraft, would take 70,000 years to get to the next nearest star if it were heading the right direction, which it isn't. Well, he forgot to add one little factor. It doesn't have a propulsion system on it. It's been coasting since it left the vicinity of the Earth. Now, would you say the best way to communicate across the ocean is to throw a bottle in the ocean with a message inside? Of course not. You know, but these academic types, they don't know about fusion propulsion. As a matter of fact, Dr. Seth Shostak of the SETI Institute, he wrote a book, Hunting for Life, and he said, well, fission and fusion rockets aren't worth anything either. It's obvious he didn't know anything about them. So I try to keep these guys honest. Incidentally, I debated Seth on Coast to Coast Radio, and I got 57% of the vote, and he got 33%, and 10% said, I don't know who won. Well, he hadn't done his homework. And I know that, you see. I don't just say that. When he and I both got a free trip on the Queen Elizabeth II from England to New York, I gave 3 lectures. He gave 3 lectures. We each listened to the other lecture. We were cordial to each other. And I talked about my 5 large-scale scientific studies and asked about who had read this one, this one, this one. He hadn't read any of them. Now, many months later, after our debate, I said, how about if I send you my book, Flying Saucers in Science? Okay, and he gave me his address, and I did send it to him. And then several months after that, on Coast to Coast, he said he had it on his nightstand. Didn't say he'd read it. You understand? And that's the problem. We've got discussion in a vacuum here, the vacuum of outer space. You won't find the SETI books. SETI stands for Silly Effort to Investigate. I'm sure you knew that. SETI. Silly Effort to Investigate.
Aren't you a SETI or Graham?
No, that's C-SETI, Darren. It's different.
No, but didn't you used to be part of the, didn't you used to let them use your resources of your laptop or some shit?
Yeah, I did, yeah. Way back when. SETI at home, that's okay.
Yeah.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. But, you know, you realize that SETI refuses to reference the UFO information.
Yeah.
They have provided not one bit of evidence that there's anybody out there, no less anybody out there sending signals using a technology that we can decode, if you will. You know, are they sending AM or FM? And my radio doesn't automatically pick up every station. I got to tune it.
So what do you think would be a better way to use that SETI money for, you know, trying to explore for signals in outer space?
Well, I don't think we should be looking for signals from outer space.
No?
Let's look at the evidence relating to the visitors to planet Earth. That's much more important. You realize there's a little problem here for SETI. If aliens are visiting, who needs to listen? Learn sign language, maybe, you know.
Learn how to wave. Hello.
Yeah, hi there, folks. What can we do for you? I mean, you realize, why don't they land, people say? Well, on the White House lawn, forget it. It's a no-fly zone, and we have airplanes ready to go up and chase anybody, and there were loads of sightings in 1952 over Washington, D.C., and the airplanes were scrambled, and they had radar visual cases and so forth, and incidentally, it's lost in history, but the Air Force regulations for pilots at that time, 1952, was shoot them down if they don't land when instructed to do so. And I've had 7 different people after lectures come up and tell me quietly about being at a military base where planes were sent up, or a plane was sent up and didn't come back. There were 200 plus fatal military plane crashes in the period from 51 to 55. The 3 of the pilots had over 100 missions in Korea, came back to the United States, and there were MiGs trying to shoot them down in Korea, you understand. They come back to the United States. I mean, you got to be a good pilot to survive 100 missions when people are trying to shoot you down. They come back to the United States, no MiGs, and 3 of them died in fatal military crashes.
Yeah, didn't the military change its stance somewhere around Vietnam at shooting at the UFOs because they were?
Well, it appears that they did.
Yeah.
After that, don't send guys up to their death. So what I'm saying is, there's a lot going on that we don't hear about, especially from the city people, and they'll tell you, look, Seth said the proof that the government can't keep secrets. I mean, I talk about a cosmic Watergate. He says the proof they can't keep secrets is how much we know about what a bad job FEMA did when Katrina happened. And, there are loads of examples of spending lots of money under security. That isn't one of them. Now, Dr. Tyson said the proof that we can't keep secrets, the government can't keep secrets, said this in a public lecture at Penn State University, is how much we know about President Clinton's genitalia. Very clever remark. Totally unrelated to the question of whether secrets can be kept.
So speaking of secrets, we already pretty much know your stance on Lazar, but he let out a big secret saying that he worked on UFOs at Area 51. So, what? I mean,
was it a secret or was it a lie?
That's right. Yeah. So, what would be the purpose of the hoax? Like, why would George Knapp and Lear get behind him on this? What's your opinion of that stuff?
I consider George Knapp the number one ranking UFO journalist, if you will, journalist who knows about UFOs. When my book came out, Flying Saucers and Science, I asked that I talk about it with George, and we set a date, and he had read it and asked the best questions. Part of the problem is that, and the only reason I went to find out about Lazar was that people were asking me about him because he was claiming to be a nuclear physicist, and they know I am. So what do you think, Stan? Well, I thought I'd better check to see whether he's got the credentials he claims. And, they're pretty impressive. Masters in physics from MIT, Master in electronics from Caltech. That's pretty special stuff. So I checked with MIT, talked to 5 different offices. Nobody ever heard of him. I talked to legal counsel who said there's no way to wipe his record out, anybody's record out. Caltech never heard of him. George Knapp gave me the name of Bob's high school. I called, had a very interesting conversation. It turned out he was in the bottom third of his high school class, and he had taken one science course, chemistry, and he graduated in August, not with his class. Now, to get into MIT, you need to be at least in the top 20% of your class. He was in the bottom third. I know about that because I was accepted there out of high school. I couldn't afford to go. The tuition was too high back then. $950. Of course, it was 1951, and that was a lot of money.
Now it's about 25,000 like that. Oh yeah, well that's gone up in its own.
Yeah, just a little. And then also on the air in Rachel, Nevada, the home of the Little Alien, most famous hamburger joint in the country, I guess. He was asked to name some of his professors. He named a guy called Bill Duxler. He'll remember me from Caltech, physics. So I looked in my directory, the American Physical Society. I, of course, am a member. Bob isn't a member of anything, has never published any papers. And I found Duxler, and turns out I never taught at Caltech, only at Pierce Junior College. I mean, it's close geographically, but not intellectually in California. And he checked and found that he'd had Bob in a night school course at Pierce Junior College at the same time when Bob was supposedly at MIT. So why? Look, I'm a dumb old physicist. I'm not a psychiatrist. Why was he looking for attention? Did somebody pay him to tell his phony story? I don't know. My question is he telling the truth? And yes, I talked to a guy who was a consultant there, a PhD from MIT, matter of fact, at Los Alamos. And he saw Bob there and was at a security briefing, so he obviously had a clearance. Bob's name was in the phone book at Los Alamos. He worked at the big Meson accelerator facility. None of that proves he was a scientist. They needed technicians out there. Lots of people work out there who aren't scientists. I know. I visited Los Alamos more than once.
Janitors.
Well, okay. They need clearances too, incidentally. I'd give him credit for being a technician. He's pretty handy. Well, let me give you another example. He said that they had 500 pounds of element 115. Wow. Well, the half-life is less than 2 minutes. You cannot collect 500. You can't collect 1 pound. The big experiment that revealed the existence of 115 produced 4 atoms of it. And by this time, they run it again in other accelerators. It's over 100 atoms. You can't do anything with 100 atoms. So what I'm saying is here we have a pattern of misrepresentation. Is that a nice way of saying that?
Yeah, that's pretty politically correct.
You know, I thought maybe they would be going down the disinformation route with him, but you would think that he would have had the proper credentials then. You know, it wouldn't be so easy to debunk his actual education. So,
well, it turns out lots of people don't check on other people. I called the Air Force Academy one time about somebody who claimed to have a degree from there, and I was suspicious because he didn't sound like it. And I talked to the registrar, and no, he didn't graduate from there. I said, do you get a lot of calls about people who claim to have gone there and didn't? All the time was her answer. And she says, we're a prestigious place, and people throw it on their resume, and once in a while somebody checks. You know, I'm impressed with Bob. I was there in Arizona when he did the long interview with George. And, you know, and I still am impressed with George. But it's hard for me to imagine that the government couldn't do better than having a guy without any diplomas, without any papers. And do you know anybody who has a diploma from a prestigious university who doesn't still have a copy?
Yeah. So this was the recent, like last year's. Was that last year when you saw him there? Then.
Yeah, February.
So you still maintain the same position after that, even.
Me or him?
You.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had given him a list of questions. They wanted questions from people to be asked, and they didn't ask any of my questions.
Of course.
And he and George dashed out right at the end of the program. So I couldn't go any farther than that. But look, if you ask me why he did, I'm the wrong guy to ask. There are a lot of people who lie about their background. There was a guy who was going to be a football coach at Notre Dame who tacked on an unreal degree who lost the job because of that.
So in your experience working on these secret projects and stuff, what do you think the chances are that there could be something like that at a place like Area 51 where these guys are actually reverse engineering saucers and whatnot? Do you actually think that's possible?
Well, sure. And look, there have been a number of crashes. Roswell isn't the only one. There's a new book out, Incident at Aztec. Also,
I heard about that one.
And it's a darn good study by the Ramseys, Scott and Suzanne. And boy, they did a bang-up job. Everybody used to think that was a phony story, but they dug into it. Of course, Suzanne her family is from New Mexico, so they could go out there and they had a place to stay and so forth. But Scott sells electrical equipment, and he had customers out there too. So, but they really dug into it. Get the facts. That's what it's all about. So I'm not saying there isn't anybody working on reverse engineering UFOs. I'm not saying that at all. And Area 51 might be one place you'd do it. Los Alamos is another. There are a lot of places. People don't realize Los Alamos has more than 6,000 employees.
Yeah, that's crazy. We were just looking into Brookhaven Labs for this movie that we watched, like this sci-fi movie, and Brookhaven's got like over 3,000 people. So there's like out of 2 labs, there's 10,000 people working in those labs.
There's Oak Ridge National Laboratory. There's Sandia National Laboratory. There's Livermore National Laboratory. These have thousands. The budget for Los Alamos last year was over $2 billion. And would you believe, I had 2 different professors in radio shows say, look, if Roswell had happened, they'd had to pull half the physics props out of colleges to analyze that stuff. And I laughed and I said, you got to be kidding. There are plenty of people with clearances and talent. The 3 nuclear weapons labs, when I checked a few years back, the total budget was greater than that for the National Science Foundation. 3 nuclear weapons labs. There's handbooks out there too. But there's somehow in the academic world, they think the only place research gets done is academia. And that's simply not true. And it's easy to prove it isn't true.
Where do you fall in on...
Leaving out, of course, the NSA, the CIA, and the NRO. And the DIA, and there's a whole bunch of these intelligence agencies. And there's an important point here that I need to bring up. The Air Force will tell you that, well, we had Project Blue Book, and that was it. And when it was canceled in '69, that was the end of it, and there's no national security aspect, and nothing to it. Well, that's a lie also. In 1969, early on, Dr. Condon of the University of Colorado study, in his big fat report, the scientific study on UFOs, they recommended that Project Blue Book be closed. So the Air Force asked a general, Carol Bolander, who was an engineer on the lunar excursion module. Remember, we landed on the moon in 1969.
Allegedly.
No alleged as far as I'm concerned. The introduction to, or the foreword to my book, Flying Saucers and Science, was done by Edgar Mitchell, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the 6th man to walk on the moon. So,
hey, do you think they saw saucers up there, like the rumor goes?
Well, I don't know whether they saw saucers up there or not. That I don't have an answer for. But I do think we landed there. But the important thing is that it was a major effort involving loads of people, thousands of people, just as the Manhattan Project involved tens of thousands of people, and with a big budget. To separate uranium isotopes, we built a mile-long facility. This is during World War II, mind you. It used 5% of the electrical power being produced in the United States to pump a uranium-containing gas through little holes and nickel plates through this mile-long facility, all in secret, mind you, to gradually enrich the uranium. 5% electrical power. And that's why it was in Tennessee, because they had the Tennessee Valley Agency there. So, there was a lot going on that people don't seem to understand, aren't aware of. And somebody undoubtedly received pieces of the wreckage. And, well, I'll give you a specific example. I was the first to talk to Major Jesse Marcel, who was the intelligence officer in Roswell. And they found lots of pieces, small pieces of stuff, shiny, metallic, foil-like material, a lot of it that if you crumbled, it would uncrumble and so forth. Mm-hmm. Well, my approach to all this thing would have been, you send this stuff out to your best classified labs and you say, what is this stuff? You don't tell them where you got it. They don't have a need to know for that. and a guy comes back to you and says, I don't know where you got this stuff, but it's a combination of samarium and cobalt. Why would you put those two together? Not your problem. Send it off to other people. What are the electrical, magnetic, thermal, nuclear properties of this stuff? And the guy comes back and says, I measured the highest magnetic moment of any material I ever measured. Make a great permanent magnet. And believe it or not, the ghetto blasters, the magnets in them years ago, were samarium and cobalt. Well, I used to suggest that maybe we learned about that from UFOs. Well, I was doing an article. I did a weekly science commentary for CBC Radio here in Fredericton. This is in the 80s. And I was reading an article about new and better permanent magnets. Neodymium iron boron, and there really is such stuff. And at the end of the article, it said the original work on samarium cobalt was done at Wright Air Development Center, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where I know some of the wreckage from Roswell went. I just laughed my head off. I'll bet I know where that idea came from. Doesn't tell you how to build a saucer, but it sure can give you a strong magnetic field.
What do you think about summoning UFOs in the desert and these groups like CSETI? And do you think there's anything to that?
I'm not a big fan of that. No, I think it's a good way for some people to make money.
Hey, that's what I think too.
It gets people outside, and I guess I can't complain about that. It's night in the desert.
Yeah, it gets people looking up.
Yeah, and that's a good thing.
Spending money.
Eating peyote.
Well, a leader of one of the SETI groups offered people an opportunity. They could come to his farm in Virginia, and it would only cost $600 for the weekend, and all expenses covered. And he would tell them everything he knew, but they would have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I think that's funny when you're talking about disclosure. And, you better sign a non-disclosure agreement. So, no, I'm not a fan of SETI, of the disclosure movement project, whatever you want to call it.
What about consciousness in general? Like, how does that have... Grant Cameron's done a lot of work. There's been a lot of work done now that somehow our consciousness is related to the phenomena.
Well, wouldn't it be astonishing if an advanced civilization didn't know more about these, I'll call them paranormal things, telepathy, reincarnation, mind control? I would expect an advanced civilization to know a heck of a lot more about those things than we do. And you can see almost all the best abduction cases. It's clear that telepathy is the means of communication. And in my book, Kathleen Marden, Betty Hill's niece, and she's a top-notch abduction investigator. And in our book, Science Was Wrong, we each did 7 chapters. She did a whole fine chapter on, I'll call it, evidence for paranormal phenomena. Published papers in the academic scientific literature, which are ignored by the people who say there is no such thing. Don't bother me. There are 4 basic rules for debunkers. Doesn't matter what you're debunking. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. What the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier. And do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble, and nobody will know the difference anyway. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about ghosts or telepathy or saucers. You find the same thing. And it's a sad commentary about our society, but it's true.
It must be changing a little bit now with the internet, and with what we're doing right now is going to go out, in a week or two to all over the world. People are going to hear this. They've heard you a lot. You've been doing this for decades. Has it changed? Is it opening up? I seem to always want to ask this question, but I'm super interested on how things are changing over the last even 5 or 10 years.
People are very receptive. But they almost always have been, much to my surprise. At the beginning, I was worried about I was going to get a real hard time from debunkers, not at my lectures. So I just spoke in England. I've spoken in 19 countries, or 18, 19 coming up. And exposure, everywhere it's pretty much the same. People are interested, excited, intrigued. And, an illustration of this, in one college class earlier in the day to promote my evening lecture, the instructor and I worked out a little scheme. Let's poll the students, but let's have them vote with their eyes closed so they're not influenced by the other students. And you count the votes, I said to him. Fine. Well, it turns out 80% of the kids thought most people didn't believe in UFOs, but 80% of them did believe in UFOs. Yeah. So that's why I've had so few hecklers. Because most people are closet ufologists, if you want to put it that way.
But how much of that is gonna, like, when are we gonna be able to see a change in the mainstream paradigm? Like, how much of this groundswell do we need after decades of people believing more?
Remember, the government's got good reasons for keeping things secret. And people say, why don't they land on the White House lawn and so forth and so on about the aliens? But why doesn't the government tell us what it wants to know? But we want to know. Are they fearful of panic, War of the Worlds and all that stuff? I don't think so. I think a quick rundown on reasons for the cover-up. Hey, you want to figure out how the darn things work. They make wonderful weapons delivery and defense systems. You set up your secret project. And rule number one for security, people have forgotten there was a long, hard Cold War out there. Rule number one is you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies. They read the papers too and listen to radio shows. Second problem is the opposite side of the coin. What if the other guys figure out how they work before we do? We don't want them to know. We know. They know. Weapon, counter-weapon, counter-weapon, bigger spears, stronger shields. This is an age-old game. The third problem is, suppose an announcement were made by two highly trusted individuals around the world. A little hard to find, but my best choice is the Pope and the Queen. What if they were to make an announcement? We have it on good authority that Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft, and we're able to announce that there will be a number of international conferences over the next 6 months discussing all the implications of that. What would happen? Well, church attendance would go up, mental hospital admissions would go up, stock market would go down because uncertainty is the big enemy. But I think one of the biggest things that would happen is that the younger generation would push for a new view of ourselves. Instead of as Canadians, Americans, Greeks, Peruvians, whatever, Chinese, Indian, Earthling. I know of no government on this planet that wants its citizens to owe their allegiance to the planet. Nationalism is the only game in town. The total military budget this year on this planet is $1 trillion. A lot of kids died of starvation last night and tomorrow and the next day and so forth. $1 trillion on things military. And so when people say, why would aliens come here? One reason, I think, would be to quarantine us. Look, in World War II, we killed 50 million of our own kind. We destroyed 1,700 cities with those big blockbuster bombs and so forth. And since the war, and this surprises people, we have exploded 2,000 plus little nuclear weapons.
Since
2,000. We're not nice guys. Anybody who comes here recognizes, you leave radioactivity and so forth. These guys are onto the nuclear stuff, and there's a book, Nukes and UFOs, by Robert Hastings. And former military guy, Robert Salas, who was at the Minuteman missile launch facility where the saucer came and 10 Minuteman missiles went down, one after the other. Not supposed to happen. Can't happen, but it did. So the aliens are obviously concerned about our nuclear weapons. So we, as a planet, aren't ready to join the Galactic Federation. Surely they won't allow people in who are as primitive as we are.
What about Denisovians?
About who?
Darren thinks he has some ancient Denisovian blood, so he's joking around about it. So,
well, okay. But you get my point.
Yeah.
We live in a strange world.
So what about
go on.
What about the beyond the government, like the secret breakaway civilization type stuff? Like you talk about, of course, some of the logical reasons why the government doesn't want to give up any of this technology. But what are your thoughts about an organization that's beyond the government, sort of more international, that have sort of the lid on this?
Well, I don't know if there is such an organization. I know conspiracy theorists love it, but I'm not one of the conspiracy theorists. Look, any sensible billionaire would want to know what's going on, because if the secret comes out, it might affect all his investments,
Right.
So he'd be interested. But I see no signs of them ruling the roost,
Of a shadowy elite.
Yeah, of course. They know everything. And maybe they do. But I can prove to you that the NSA is covering stuff up. Not just because of Mr. Snowden, and the NRO. Many people never heard of the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, Stan. You're one of the original MJ-12 investigators. If you could, for the audience, maybe sort of give the rundown of those documents and what happened there.
That's why I mentioned General Bolender, because what he said in his memo was that reports which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system, which is an extremely incredible statement. He said that in 1969. And he also, the paragraph later, said, if we close Project Blue Book, and it was closed as a result of this memo, the public won't have a place to report sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. Okay, where did those cases go? Well, when I managed to locate Bolender 10 years after this, and talked to him, I said, it seems to me like you're saying there are two separate communication channels here. One for national security-related sightings, and I mentioned one that I had just heard about at that time of a saucer going down the runway at a SAC base where nuclear weapons were stored. That's national security, no matter how you slice it. He agreed with me. I said, if my wife and I see a saucer we're out on the street and we see a saucer go by, big deal. It happens all the time. Two separate channels. He said, yes. So where did those sightings go? And I say to Operation Majestic 12. We got a roll of film, which had some incredible documents, and then that was followed over the next few years by documents that I can prove to you are phony. But I've got a whole book, Top Secret Magic, MAJIC, and I deal with all the objections to the documents and show that none of them hold up. There really was an MJ-12. I'm sure the name has changed. Majestic 12, Magic 12, established by President Truman. And one of the clinchers was the group was named in this briefing document for President Eisenhower. And one of the people on the list, there were 5 military guys and 5 scientists and Secretary of Defense and the 12th guy. One of the guys on the list was totally improbable, Dr. Donald Menzel, Harvard University professor of astronomy, who had written 3 anti-UFO books. How could he be a member of a group that knew about crash saucers, alien bodies, etc.? Well, to make a long story short, I had to get permission from 3 different people to see his papers at Harvard. All these guys were dead, which is very convenient, of course. And I discovered, to my total shock, because I didn't like him while he was alive, he was such a debunker, he told Jack Kennedy that he had a longer continuous association with the NSA of anybody, 30 years at that time. That was 1960 when he wrote that to Kennedy. And it turns out he was a world-class cryptographer and did classified work for 20 different companies and for the CIA and other agencies. That was a real shocker, because it was so totally unexpected. I got proof of it. got his copies of his letters to Kennedy and his unpublished autobiography, in which he mentions there was a loyalty hearing. That's how I found out about this. They were trying to take away his clearance, and what was he doing with the clearance? So I followed up on it, and the story's in my book. But incidentally, if people are interested in my books, my website is www.stantonfriedman.com. And the one thing I can offer, if you buy your books from me that you won't get from Amazon, is an autograph, free, personalized. And so, Majestic 12, and you'll get all kinds of people talking, those were all phony, and I think there are 4 genuine documents. I don't care about the 50 that are phony.
Mm-hmm.
The basketball coach says, yeah, I know most people aren't 7 feet tall. Give me one. You keep the midgets, So you got to focus on what's relevant. And yes, a chemical rocket won't get you to the stars. A fusion rocket would. Can I build one for you tomorrow? No. Cost a ton of money.
Next week?
Maybe. With enough.
Not even next year. And I don't think Earthlings should be trying to go to the stars anyway until we get our act together. Who speaks for the planet? Nobody I know. Certainly the President of the United States doesn't speak for 7 billion Earthlings.
What I got a data question for you, and help settle well, it's not really an argument, but
a discussion.
We talk about, because I think what do you think the reporting rate, like a reporting rate to MUFON would be of say if 1,000 people seen it? Do you think how many of those people would report to a MUFON?
MUFON and other organizations, or just MUFON?
MUFON, because it was a MUFON thing that I judged you said unfairly.
Okay.
Well, MUFON typically these days is getting roughly 1,000 reports a month. And I get people call me, how come there haven't been any sightings lately, Stan? They don't know about those 1,000 reports. And so, typical large number of sightings, I'd say 20% are unknowns. I mean, in Blue Book Special Report 14, 21.5%. In the Condon study, it was 30%, believe it or not. In Dick Hall's The UFO Evidence, it was like 18%.
So I'm wondering more what the reporting rate would be. Like how many people, if 1,000 people seen a UFO over a city, say over a city of 1 million people, 1,000 people see the same thing. How many of those people report it to MUFON?
I don't know, maybe 100. But I think back, there's going to be a big discussion about a new movie about the Phoenix Lights.
Yeah.
And thousands of people saw those things.
Yeah.
And the Air Force lied about them. As a matter of fact, the governor lied, but he came clean later on the Larry King show. He had been an Air Force pilot. And he saw the Phoenix Lights. And he sure as heck knew it wasn't any conventional airplane, certainly not a National Guard airplane or anything like that. But he was afraid of panic and all this other stuff, so he had one of his guys in the office dress up in a alien outfit and made fun of the whole business. But to his credit, ex-Governor Symington did come clean on Larry King.
I think Stan had that question answered when he was doing his lectures, and he was asking how many people had a sighting and how many people reported it, and it was like 5%.
10% had sightings and 90% didn't report it.
Yeah, so that's a really
so
low
I think it would be
90%.
less than 10.
Yeah.
Did you report yours, Graham?
I did, and I went back to MUFON later, and it was gone. So that was frustrating.
Well, I've got a couple of listener questions here.
Okay.
Okay.
From, I guess we already answered the one about putting Greer on the same list as Lazar and Corso.
Okay.
So we got a couple from Adam Loyal, a Grimerican in his own right. The first one is, have you ever had any experiences with psychedelics?
You mean, have I taken LSD or something?
I suppose. You don't have to answer that.
I haven't taken any drugs, but I've never had a UFO sighting either. Look, I chased neutrons and gamma rays. Radiation shielding was my business for 14 years. Never saw a neutron or a gamma ray. They're real too.
Yeah.
He's got his next question is what do you have any synchronicities that I can rate?
Synchronicities.
It's kind of like his book when he bought that first book. That was a synchronicity in a way.
Nah, I don't think so.
I don't know. I can't think of any offhand. I'm just a straightforward, dumb old nuclear physicist, you know.
And then his last one is, what wisdom do you have for the next generation of ufologers?
Well, I just gave a paper at the MUFON conference about how to make ufology more respectable. And my major point is have facts in hand before putting mouth or computer in gear. Don't be ashamed. Don't be afraid to speak up. Tell it like it is. It's okay. Make sure you can back up anything you say. But I've been out there. After the first 700 lectures, you get a feeling for how people react.
Yeah.
And in all kinds of places and big colleges, and I've spoken at Harvard, and I've spoken at UC Berkeley, and a lot of other places, obviously. And it's okay. Just make sure you do your homework. And don't presume we know all there is to know.
Yeah.
That's where the debunkers get into trouble. Well, I can't figure out how to go to the stars, so nobody can. You know, that sort of thing. And what do you mean they use telepathy? Well, that's what the investigations indicate.
Yeah.
I'd recommend the book by Kathleen Martin and myself, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. And what makes that book, in that case, so important is that the psychiatrist who did the hypnosis was Dr. Benjamin Simon, who was a world-class expert on post-traumatic stress disorder, shell shock war veterans. He ran a hospital with 3,000 beds after the Second World War, and he worked out the techniques for getting people back together, so to speak. You know, a guy has his buddy's head blown off next to him. That's a little hard to handle. And Dr. Simon is the one in the movie. The Army made a movie, Let There Be Light, about shell shock war veterans and getting them back to being good again. And he has said in writing that the emotional intensity in Betty and Barney's voices, they did 10 sessions each separately, was every bit as great as that in these shell shock war veterans. And he had to stop one session each because he wasn't sure they could handle it, the emotional. Now, coming from him, that means something. A garden variety party hypnotist doesn't mean a darn thing. But coming from Dr. Ben Simon, it means a great deal. So you got to go with the flow, go with the data, go with the guys who know. And we have that data out there.
Good advice. I agree. There's enough data now. So we have one more question here from Red Pill Junkie, who's a regular guy on our show here. He says, if you ever had a chance to meet a real alien, let's say extraterrestrial, and had permission to ask one question and one question only, what would it be?
Why are you guys here?
Yeah. Makes sense to me, your hypothesis about after we became nuclear. That why wouldn't they show up, right?
Why do you think they're here,
to the
Stan?
Neighborhood. That's for sure.
Why do you think they're here, Stan?
Because we're a threat. Yeah.
Well, I think quarantine would be first on my list. Second, I've got a whole list in my book, Flying Saucers and Science. They're graduate students doing their thesis research on the development of a primitive society. They're being punished. Spend 2 weeks near Earth. That's punishment that lasts a lifetime. You know, maybe this was a prison, a penal colony, They dumped all the bad boys and girls here, and that's why we're so nasty to each other. And, Australia and Georgia were both started by convicts. The Australians seem to be proud of it, at least when I was down there. The Georgians aren't, but that's different. So I think there are a whole, why did people travel? And if you go back a few hundred years, look at all those guys who went after gold in the Yukon or in California. The guys who went after oil in the oil patch. And people have loads of reasons for traveling. But one of them, I would expect, is to take care of threats to the neighborhood.
So do you think that the government is actually in cahoots then with the extraterrestrials, and maybe there's some sort of agenda there? Or?
It wouldn't surprise me if there was some kind of an agreement. You leave us alone and we will leave you guys alone. That wouldn't surprise me.
It would make sense.
You could, for example, they're looking at genetics. There's some diseases that only a few people have, so you got to pick up an awful lot of specimens to get some DNA from them, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
And if I'd said that before we invented or discovered DNA, you'd have said, you're crazy. What do you mean? There isn't any DNA. What kind of nonsense is that? Well, it's real, and we can manipulate it. So aliens may be looking for goodies for their colonies. Who knows?
Have you ever thought about what you would do if you had unlimited resources in ufology? Like, if somebody donated $1 billion to you or a few $1 million?
I've thought of some things I would do. Of course, I would. First of all, I'd have every newspaper in the country carry an article saying, if you have a piece of a saucer, sitting in the bureau drawer, contact us and we'd like to get tests run on it.
Nice.
If you have a sighting, had a sighting when you were in the military, so you might have been involved with radar, airplanes, people forget. Most individuals don't have their own radar set, don't have their own spy satellite. The NSA is capable of doing things that you and I aren't. And the same with the Air Defense Command. I'd love to be in an airplane chasing a UFO and have my radar and 6 instruments picking up signals from the UFO. But I don't have that situation. So I think if we had enough money, I would set up a number of individual committees to deal with certain aspects of this. What does it mean for religion? A serious discussion. There's a wonderful book by Dr. Barry Downing called The Bible and Flying Saucers. He has a bachelor's in physics and a doctor of divinity. Divine physics is his beat. And he goes through the Old and New Testament and finds saucer sightings. Well, that has some implications. And part of what we're trying to do here is to get rid of our arrogance. Not too many years ago, we'd have said we're the only thinking beings in the whole darn galaxy. There are no other solar systems out there. If there were, we'd know about them because we're so smart. I don't think anybody's saying that now, and especially after Kepler. Yeah. The general consensus now, and I checked with 3 astronomers recently, is that there's about 1 planet per star. Some have 8 planets, some have none, but overall average about 1 per star. Well, how many people recognize that there are at least 10,000 stars within 100 light years of here?
Wow.
That means about 10,000 planets. That's exciting, to me anyway. So I would expect the Galactic Federation to have a neighborhood border guard, if you will. We just celebrated Pearl Harbor Day. Well, some of us did, because I remember it. Well, I do. I was 7 years old at that time, I guess. And we, to show what wrong thinking gets you, in the Army-Navy football game the week before Pearl Harbor Day, there was a picture of the USS Arizona, big battleship. And in the text, it said, nobody's ever sunk a battleship from the air. Pearl Harbor Day, a week later, they sunk the USS Arizona, 1,100 guys on board. The Japanese knew you could sink a ship with a plane.
Wow.
And so that's why I mentioned the book, Science Was Wrong. There's a long history of smart people saying stupid things, including an astronomer who said man would never fly any distance in an airplane. Another one, umpteen years later, saying space travel is utter bilge. That was a year before Sputnik. The first comment was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. And so we have to be very careful that we don't predetermine things when we don't have enough data.
Well said. So, Stanton, we don't want to keep you for too long here. We've already gone past time here.
Yeah,
so
I
is there
know.
anything? Thanks for spending all this time with us. Is there anything else you feel like we left out that you want to tell the world?
No, I think just not only keep your eyes on the sky, but recognize that we live in a big universe, and there are guys that could be 1 million years more advanced than we are. It wouldn't be surprising if they can do things that we can't do. A little ignorance should get rid of a lot of arrogance. And I think we need to get rid of some of that arrogance and recognize the cosmos is not the way we think it was years ago.
Mm. Well said. Are you speaking anywhere coming up at all? Are you going to be at UFO Congress this year? Or?
I'll be at the International UFO Congress, yes. And I'll be speaking in Roswell, of course. And if they look on my website, they'll find a list of lectures coming up.
Okay, good. That's all up to date. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Well, thanks a lot, Stan.
Thank
Great
you.
chatting with you.
My pleasure.
Have a good trip to India in January there.